Forget the peaceful Sunday school images you've seen in movies. In the year 30, stepping outside your home after sunset wasn't a walk. It was a death sentence. Imagine a world with zero light, no police, and city gates that lock you out in the cold with the predators. For Jesus and his followers, life wasn't a calm stroll through Galilee. It was a brutal survival thriller. Today, we're stripping away the Hollywood polish to see the dust, the danger, and the raw reality of the ancient world. If you think you know this story, think again. Look around. Every single thing you see is a shade of dusty brown. It's a monochromatic sea of raw stone and sun-baked mud bricks, designed to camouflage houses against the dry, jagged hills of Judea. Forget the Hollywood version of the ancient world. Forget the gleaming white marble avenues, the grand columns, and the sprawling plazas of Rome. That was the 1%. The reality for the people living in the villages where Jesus walked was a brutal, daily sensory assault. As we step into a typical town, the first thing you'll feel is the claustrophobia. In modern cities, we have sidewalks, parks, and zoning laws. Here, there is no such thing as public space. What we would call a street was actually a jagged, irregular alley of packed earth, rarely wider than 2 meters. If you stretch out your arms, you can almost touch the walls on both sides. There are no sidewalks to protect you from the traffic. Walking to the market isn't a stroll. It's a physical struggle for territory. You are constantly dodging heavily laden pack donkeys, neighbors carrying massive jars, and the livestock that move through these veins of the city. Now, take a breath, if you can. This is where the sensory shock hits the hardest. In these narrow corridors, the air is thick and heavy. You're smelling a suffocating mixture of thick wood smoke from cooking fires trapped between the high walls, blending with the sharp, acidic stench of open sewage that often runs right down the center of the path. There was no underground plumbing here. Everything, waste, gray water, scraps, ended up in the dirt where you walked. You'll notice the houses themselves look like small, windowless fortresses. They aren't inviting. The walls are thick, rough, and turned away from the street. There are no decorative front yards or large windows looking out onto the alley. Why? Because in the first century, the street was a place of danger. It was the territory of thieves, tax collectors, and Roman patrols. The street was something to be endured, not enjoyed. If the architecture feels defensive, that's because it was. This chaotic layout wasn't an accident. It was a survival strategy. The winding, narrow paths made it impossible for an invading force or a group of bandits to move quickly. But this design created a strange paradox. While the thick walls were meant to keep the dangers of the street out, they couldn't keep the neighbors out. Because these houses were literally glued together to save material and maximize space, you weren't just living in a house. You were living in a hive. As you walked deeper into the village, notice the sounds. The silence we value today was a luxury no one could afford back then. Every cough, every argument, every whispered secret from the house next door vibrated through the shared stone walls. You are about to realize that in this world, physical walls were thick, but the concept of privacy was an impossible dream. In our modern world, privacy is a basic right. We have soundproof drywall, double-paned windows, and noise-canceling headphones. We can close a door and disappear. But if you were living in a village in Galilee 2,000 years ago, the very concept of privacy would sound like a science fiction movie. It simply didn't exist. To understand why, you have to look at the architecture of survival. These houses weren't built as isolated units on a suburban street. They were insulated. Clusters of small rooms built around a shared courtyard, all physically fused together. Because wood and stone were expensive, families saved resources by sharing walls. Your neighbor's bedroom wall wasn't just near yours, it was yours. This physical connection turned every village into a single, massive, living organism. In these homes, sound was public property. Imagine waking up at 4 a.m. You don't need an alarm clock. You hear the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of your neighbor's wife grinding grain on a stone mill. You hear the wet cough of the elderly man 2 doors down. You hear the muffled argument of the couple next door about a missing copper coin. Every whisper, every groan of a wooden door, and every cry of a hungry infant vibrated through those thin mud and stone walls. You weren't just living with your immediate family, you were living under the constant auditory surveillance of your entire clan. Think about the psychological pressure of that for a second. Today we worry about our digital privacy, cookies, data tracking, and social media algorithms. But back then, the algorithm was your aunt, your cousin, and the village elder living 6 feet away. There were no secrets. If you were lazy, the whole village heard you sleeping in. If you were angry, the whole village heard your temper. Your reputation, your honor, wasn't based on what you posted online. It was based on what your neighbors heard through the walls every single day. If this feeling of suffocating closeness sounds familiar, it's because it hasn't disappeared. This is the point where the ancient world meets our modern reality. If you walk through the winding, vertical alleys of a favela in Rio de Janeiro today, or the crowded slums of Mumbai, you are looking at the direct spiritual descendant of ancient Judea. In these places, people live in houses made of thin corrugated metal or scrap wood, stacked on top of each other. Just like in ancient Capernaum, the air in a modern slum is a thick soup of shared lives. You hear the TV from 3 houses away, the sizzle of oil from a neighbor's pan, and the constant hum of thousands of people breathing in the same tight space. In both worlds, the ancient and the modern, there is no off switch. The alleys that never sleep create a unique kind of human being. It forces a radical level of transparency. You cannot pretend to be someone you're not when everyone knows exactly what your life sounds like behind closed doors. For many of us watching this from a quiet room or a private office, this level of exposure feels like a nightmare. We call it overcrowding. We call it a lack of personal space. But for the people of the first century, this was the only way to stay safe. Being alone was dangerous. If you were private, you were suspicious. If you were isolated, you were a target for predators or thieves. But here is the real question. Does this constant exposure make us more human or less? Before we move into the actual homes to see where they kept the animals, I want to ask you, have you ever lived in a place where you could hear every move your neighbors made? How did that change the way you acted? Let me know in the comments because it's a level of empathy most people today will never understand. Now, if you think the lack of privacy from other humans was intense, wait until you see who else was living inside the house with you. Because in the ancient world, the roommates weren't just your cousins. They were 100-pound animals, and they were the only thing keeping you from freezing to death. When you step inside a typical Galilean home from the year 30, you're hit with two things: darkness and a smell that stops you in your tracks. Your eyes need a few seconds to adjust to the gloom because there are no windows, but your nose finds the reality first. The air is thick, it's warm, damp and heavy with the scent of dry straw, raw wool, and the sharp, unmistakable sting of fresh animal dung. In our modern minds, we expect to walk into a living room. We expect a space for people. But the house of a first-century peasant wasn't designed for comfort. It was a biological survival kit. If you look down, you aren't standing on a rug or a wooden floor. You're standing on packed dirt, and you aren't alone. In the shadows of this lower level, you'll hear the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a donkey. You'll see the glint of eyes from a few goats and sheep huddled together. This is the ground floor. It's the stable, but it's inside the house. To find the humans, you have to look up. About 4 feet above the dirt floor is a raised stone platform. This is the living room, the bedroom, and the kitchen all rolled into one. This is where the family sleeps, eats, and works. Now, why would anyone choose to live like this? Why would you bring a 50-kilogram goat into your house? The answer is simple: the desert night. If the sun is a furnace during the day, the night is a freezer. Without electricity, gas, or even enough wood to keep a fire burning all night, these families needed a way to stay alive when the temperature plummeted. They used biological heaters. The body heat from the livestock on the lower level would naturally rise. It would seep into the stone platform where the family lay, huddled together under heavy wool cloaks. Sleeping next to the heavy, humid breath of an animal wasn't a sign of extreme poverty. It was the standard for almost every family. It was the difference between waking up the next morning or freezing in your sleep. This brings us to the most famous piece of furniture in history, the manger. Forget the wooden cribs you see in Christmas cards. In a real Galilean home, the manger, the phaeton, was often just a hollowed-out cavity in the edge of the stone platform itself. It was the border between the human world and the animal world. It was a stone trough where the animals reached up to eat their grain. When the ancient texts say there was no room in the inn and the baby was placed in a manger, it changes the entire scene. The word inn, kataluma, doesn't mean a hotel. It means a guest room. Most likely, the guest room of the relatives was already packed to the ceiling with other travelers. So they moved into the main room. They moved down to the only available space, the lower level, right next to the animals. In our modern eyes, this looks like filth. It looks like a health hazard. It looks like a tragedy. But to a family in the first century, that manger represented something very different. It represented the only source of heat in a cold world. The smell of the straw and the warmth of the animals weren't signs of abandonment. They were the physical sensations of survival. The manger wasn't a place of rejection. It was a place of radical intimacy. But if the winter required this warm, stinking closeness, the summer brought the opposite problem. When the July heat turned that stone box into an unbearable oven, the family had to find a way to escape the ammonia smell and the stifling air. If the ground floor was for survival, the roof was for breathing. When the sun finally set and the stones began to radiate the day's heat back at you, the family would climb a ladder to the flat roof. Made of branches and packed mud, the roof became the primary bedroom. It was the only place to catch a stray breeze and escape the biological furnace below. Life was a constant cycle of moving between the suffocating warmth of the animals and the exposed vulnerability of the rooftops. But as hard as the domestic life was, it was nothing compared to the pressure waiting for you outside. Because while the house was a struggle for heat, the village well was a struggle for honor. Imagine balancing a 20-kilogram weight plate, the size of a large microwave oven, directly on your head. Now imagine walking with it for a mile over jagged, uneven stones, under a sun that feels like a physical weight on your shoulders. This wasn't a gym challenge. This was the daily reality for every woman in a first-century village. If the house was the place where your family was heard, then the village well was the place where your character was judged. It was the courtroom of the ancient world. Every morning and evening, when the air was cool, the well became the high-stakes center of power. It was the only time women could escape the suffocating walls of the insulae. But this freedom came with a price. There was a rigid social hierarchy at the water's edge. The virtuous women, the ones with the most social capital, arrived together in groups. They talked, they laughed, and they shared the news, but they also controlled the narrative of the village. If you were a woman whose reputation was damaged, the well wasn't a social club, it was a firing squad. A single look, a whispered comment, or the deliberate turning of a back could destroy a woman's life faster than any Roman decree. This is why we see the famous Samaritan woman arriving at the well at noon, the 6th hour. Think about that choice. In the Middle East, the noon sun is a killer. It's an oven that turns the dust into steam. No one goes to the well at noon unless they are desperate to be invisible. She chose the physical agony of the heat and the 20-kilogram burden over the psychological agony of the village's judgment. She chose the burning sun over the freezing glares of the righteous women. She was practicing social distancing 2,000 years before it was a term. But here is where the story shifts. These women were the queens of the village, though history rarely gives them that title. They were the biological engines that kept the community alive. Without that water, the animals died, the children dehydrated, and the bread couldn't be made. Every drop of life in that village was bought with the sweat, the strained necks, and the calloused hands of these women. They carried the physical weight of the village on their heads and the emotional weight of the clan's honor on their hearts. And then, into this high-stakes courtroom enters a man who breaks every rule of the well. When Jesus sat by that well and spoke to that woman, he wasn't just asking for a drink, he was launching a revolution of dignity. In a world where a woman's value was often tied to her silence and her invisibility, he made her visible. He didn't meet her in the safe morning hours under the protection of the crowd. He met her in her isolation, in her shame, and in the brutal heat of her reality. He took the trial at the well and turned it into a sanctuary. This was the ultimate twist for the ancient audience. For them, the well was a place of exclusion. It was where you found out if you belonged or if you were an outcast. By speaking to her, Jesus was saying that the true living water wasn't found in the purity of your reputation, but in the depth of your humanity. He was honoring the queen who had been stripped of her crown by village gossip. But even as we look at this scene of emotional healing, we cannot forget the shadow hanging over the entire landscape. Because while the well was a place of social pressure, the road was a place of political terror. If the women carried the burden of the water jars, the men carried a much darker weight, the weight of a Roman soldier's gear. And on those dusty roads, a single mile could break a man's soul. Imagine you are walking home after a long day in the fields. Your back is aching, your sandals are worn thin, and all you can think about is the warmth of the animals and the smell of the cooking fire waiting for you. Then you hear it, the rhythmic clanking of metal on metal, the heavy, disciplined thud of iron-shod boots. A Roman patrol is coming up the road. You lower your eyes and try to become invisible against the mud walls, but it's too late. A soldier stops. He doesn't say, "Please." He doesn't even look you in the eye. He simply unbuckles his heavy military pack, filled with a tent, cooking gear, and rations, and drops it at your feet. The pack weighs nearly 30 kilograms. That's like someone handing you two large suitcases filled with rocks and telling you to start walking. This was the law of 1 mile, or angaria. Under Roman law, any soldier of the empire had the legal right to press a civilian into service. You were forced to carry their gear for exactly 1 Roman mile, about 1,000 paces. If you think this was just about physical labor, you're missing the point. This was the art of breaking trust. Rome was a master of psychological warfare. They knew that to keep a population suppressed, they didn't just need to occupy the land, they needed to occupy the mind. Every time a Jewish farmer was forced to carry a Roman pack, it was a calculated ritual of humiliation. It was a reminder that your body, your time, and your dignity did not belong to you. They belonged to the emperor. Each step you took for that soldier was a step that fueled your hatred. You weren't just carrying a bag, you were carrying the weight of your own powerlessness. And then there was the enemy within. If the Roman soldier was the boot on your neck, the tax collector was the hand in your pocket. These weren't foreigners. They were your own people, your neighbors, maybe even your cousins. They sat in booths at the edge of town, protected by Roman swords, taking your hard-earned copper coins to pay for the very army that was humiliating you. The tax collector was the ultimate symbol of a broken community. They were seen as traitors who had sold their souls for a piece of the Roman pie. In a culture built on clan loyalty and shared honor, this was a poison that was eating the society from the inside out. Trust was dead. The air was thick with the desire for revenge. Everyone was waiting for a leader to stand up and say, "Pick up a sword, kill the soldier, stone the tax collector." Instead, a carpenter from Galilee stood up and said something that sounded like insanity. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too. In our modern ears, this sounds like a call to be a doormat. We think it means just be nice. But in the first century, this was a tactical strike. Think about the psychology of that second mile. The law restricted the soldier to 1 mile. By voluntarily picking up the pack and walking the second mile, you were no longer a victim being forced. You were a human being making a choice. You were taking back the power. You were making the soldier, the most powerful man in the world, uncomfortable. You were looking at your oppressor and saying, "You can take my mile, but you cannot take my spirit." This is the true context of loving your enemies. It wasn't a soft, fluffy sentiment. It was a survival strategy for a society on the brink of collapse. Jesus knew that if his people met Roman hate with Jewish hate, they would eventually become exactly like the Romans. Forgiveness wasn't an act of weakness. It was an act of extreme courage. It was the only social antidote that could stop the cycle of violence before it burned everything down. It was about preserving your humanity when the world was trying its hardest to turn you into a slave. But as we will see, not everyone could maintain that radical level of peace. The tension between the occupied and the occupiers was a ticking time bomb. And when that bomb finally went off, it didn't just break the trust of a community, it turned the greatest city in Judea into a mountain of ash and melted gold. If you were standing on the Mount of Olives in the summer of the year 70 AD, you wouldn't be looking at a city. You would be looking at a furnace. This was the end of the world, not the end of the planet, but the end of a universe. After years of rebellion, the Roman legions under Titus had finally reached the throat of Jerusalem. The siege had been brutal. Inside the walls, the air smelled of starvation and rotting waste. Outside, the landscape was a forest of crosses, but the center of this apocalypse was a single building, the Second Temple. To the people of that time, the temple wasn't just a church or a monument. It was the anchor of reality. It was the place where heaven touched earth. It was a massive mountain of white marble and gold that dominated the skyline, reflecting the sun so brightly it was painful to look at. People believed that as long as those stones stood, the world was safe. They were wrong. When the Roman torches finally hit the tapestries, the fire was so intense that the sky over Jerusalem turned a bruised, sickly orange. But it's what happened after the fire that reveals the true greed of the empire. The temple was covered in gold. As the building burned, that gold began to melt. It turned into a liquid fire, glowing like lava, and it began to seep downward. It ran into the cracks between the massive stone blocks, stones that weighed as much as modern tanks. The Roman soldiers didn't just want to destroy the temple. They wanted that gold. To get it, they didn't just burn the building. They dismantled it. They used massive iron pry bars to heave those multi-ton blocks apart, one by one, just to scrape the cooled gold out of the crevices. This is why, when you visit Jerusalem today, you don't see a ruin. You see a void. They literally left not one stone upon another. The psychological shock was absolute. If the house of God could be turned into a pile of rubble for a few kilograms of scrap metal, then what was left? If the stones were fragile, was the faith fragile too? This is the moment where the most important building project in history began. When the survivors looked at the smoking hole where their heart used to be, they realized something terrifying and beautiful. The greatest construction projects aren't built with limestone or marble. They are built with ideas. If the temple was made of stone, it could be burned. If it was made of gold, it could be stolen. But if the temple was carried inside the human mind, through stories, through laws, through the radical act of loving one's neighbor, then no Roman legion could ever touch it. They began to build a mobile temple. This was the transition from a religion of place to a religion of people. They realized that the physical world is fundamentally fragile. It's an illusion of stability. We build massive skyscrapers, we buy expensive cars, we hoard gold, and we think we are safe. But the year 70 AD proves that matter is just dust waiting to happen. The things that actually survive are the things you cannot see. A prayer whispered in a dark alley in Judea was stronger than the marble walls of Herod. A simple act of compassion toward a tax collector was more durable than a Roman fortress. This was the greatest structure, a temple of the spirit that could be carried across borders, through wars and into the future. The Romans thought they had won because they cleared the mountain, but they had actually made the faith unstoppable. By destroying the physical center, they forced it to spread into the corners of the earth. They turned a local monument into a global movement. As we look at the dust and the ash of Jerusalem, we see the ultimate lesson of survival. Everything built with hands will eventually fall, but everything built with the soul is eternal. We've seen the darkness of the alleys, the heat of the houses, and the smoke of the falling temple. Now it's time to take these lessons back to our own world, because the dark alleys of the first century have a lot to tell us about the light we are looking for today. History isn't found in the polished marble of palaces. It lives in the dust of narrow alleys, the strain of a 20-kilogram water jar, and the humid breath of an animal in a dark room. We've seen that true light doesn't start in a throne room. It starts in a smelly manger, among the oppressed and the overlooked. If the people of Judea could find hope in a world without privacy, safety, or peace, then we can find gratitude in our abundance today. Look at your world through their eyes. Compassion isn't a luxury. It's a survival strategy. If this journey changed how you see history, hit the like button and subscribe. How will you see your own life differently today? Let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next trip back in time.